We can start now. My name is Christian Jagot, from the Center for Medieval Literature, as does our speaker today. Shazia Jagot is postdoc for some time still, I would say. She has just been offered a job at the University of Surrey in England, but she's still with us, luckily, and we'll talk about Astrolabes and Automata, and that it goes very much together with the research in general, which deals with the use of and understanding of Arabic, Islamic science and knowledge of science in European literature, in English literature, and in Chaucer specifically, I think I can say.
Yeah.
So please, Shazia.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to D-IAS for inviting me to come and give a talk this afternoon. As you can see from the title, my paper is called Medieval Machines, Astrolabes and Automata in the Global Middle Ages. But I'm going to begin this talk on medieval machines with the writings of an English poet. And I do this because I am primarily a researcher in medieval literature in its more traditional sense, so really poetry and prose. And my research at the moment is focused on the writings of Geoffrey Chaucer. So I thought it was only appropriate that I try and give you a little bit of poetry. Now, you may have heard of the name Chaucer. He is a canonical literary figure who gained the cliched reputation of the father of English poetry in the Middle Ages, and this is my favourite image of him, Lego Chaucer, that I use all the time. And in the timeline of literary history, Chaucer comes just before Shakespeare, and he was certainly an influence for the bard himself. Now, Chaucer is writing in the period of the time known as the later Middle Ages, so really towards the end of the medieval period in the later 14th century, so just before we move into the Renaissance and the early modern world. And just for those of you who don't know, the medieval period itself is designated roughly to start in the year 500 and end around 1500, so around 1,000 years of history. And these are, of course, rather arbitrary markers, but just to kind of give you a sense of the scope of historical time that we're dealing with. And I'll be going back and forward through this chronology a lot in the next 25 minutes, so just keep in mind we are talking about a large expanse of time. And I also like to warn you that we are beginning with poetry, so there's lots of words to come before we move on to technology. Now, Chaucer is most famous for his collection of tales drawn together in a frame tale narrative known as the Canterbury Tales. And it's an extract from one of these that I want to begin with. And this is one of Chaucer's unfinished works known as the Squire's Tale. And the Squire's Tale is set in the Mongol kingdom of a place called Sarai, which historically is a walled city near the Volga River. And in this tale, Chaucer provides us with a description of a magical flying horse, which is presented to the Mongol king by a knight who is welcomed at his court. Now, I'll be reading from a modern English translation of the tale, but you can see from the first line of this slide, Chaucer writes in a form of English known as Middle English, but I won't inflict that on you today. I'll just read out some modern English. And in this tale, Chaucer tells us that this horse is a steed of brass that easily and well can, in the space of one natural day, so 24 hours, take you wherever you desire. He says it can bear your body into every place to which your heart wishes to go without harm to you, through foul or fair, or if you desire to fly as high in the air as does an eagle when he desires to soar, this same steed shall bear you evermore, without harm until you be wherever you wish, though you sleep or rest on his back, and return again with a twisting of a pin. So the horse seems at first glance to be simply a magical supernatural creature. It can take you wherever you wish to go, however you wish to get there, within a short space of time. Now, the notion of this speedy translocation is considered to be a form of magical mastery, and indeed that is the reaction it garners from the common people within the tale who see it. They wonder, how does it work, and does it come from the supernatural? goes on to write that this horse of brass cannot be moved. It stands as if it were glued to the ground. No man there can drive it out of the place, despite any contrivance of windlass or pulley. And the reason why? Because they do not know the craft. And therefore in the place they have it left until the knight has taught them the manner to remove him, as you shall later hear. He goes on to say that for the people, nature nor art could him not amend to any extent, as all the people believed, but evermore their greatest wonder was how it could move, and yet it was of brass. It was from fairyland, as it seemed to the people. The common people then are stunned. The horse is large and broad and completely immovable. Neither a pulley nor a large haul, which is this word windlass, that is used for ships, can move it. Neither by art nor by nature, so neither by natural means nor the artificial can it seem to change or amend. Only the knight, it seems, is able to manipulate it, and he's the only one who can teach the people the secret, the craft, as he calls it, of how it works. The people, Chaucer tells us, think it must be from fairyland, from the magical, supernatural other world. Chaucer here then is following an earlier literary tradition that contained flying magical horses, but he makes some significant changes that make us realise that he's adapting this tradition into a more scientifically and technologically astute one. For instance, the horse he describes is not made of wood, as would be expected in such a poetic description, but of brass, a metal alloy made of copper and zinc, and this is repeated several times throughout his description, and it also seems to be an element of confusion for the people. We see in that line how they're wondering how it could move and yet was of brass. You know, it's almost like, but how is that possible? It's made out of brass. And he tells us that in order to operate the horse, one needs to use and turn a pin. So he tells us to return home again, you have to twist with a pin. And later on in the poem, he goes to tell us that this mechanism is located in the horse's ear. In fact, Chaucer's horse is made of the same material, brass, that was used for making medieval astrolabes, the handheld technological device used to read the position of the stars. And this is what an astrolabe looks like. Now, the astrolabe was first used in classical antiquity and then significantly developed by mathematicians and astronomers writing in Arabic in the medieval Islamic world. And interestingly enough, was a machine that captured the attention of this English poet. Chaucer, writing in the early 1390s, writes a treatise on the astrolabe. And again, this is also an unfinished tale. He's a poet who has a tendency not to finish his works. But he writes almost half a treatise on an astrolabe and how to use it. And this treatise is intended for his 9-year-old nephew, Lewis, but it contains fairly advanced astronomical and mathematical instruction, which I have to admit I have also struggled with, and certainly my students also struggle with whenever I try to get them to read it, which is probably telling considering it's written for a 9-year-old boy. Chaucer is in fact then the first to write such a treatise on an astrolabe in the English language. Now, in the 14th century, English did not hold the same position as a lingua franca as it does today. Instead, it was Latin that held this prestige. So it's rather important that we find Chaucer writing the scientific text in English and not in Latin. And it shows that he's both interested in and familiar with the technology of the period. And indeed, this image, which is called the Chaucer astrolabe, is an image of an astrolabe that's held currently in the British Museum in London, and it's thought to be the very machine that Chaucer looked at and modelled his own treatise on. Now, unfortunately, because of time restraints, I won't be able to get into much more detail on astrolabes, but it is worth noting, and the reason why I bring it up, is that when Chaucer describes his magical horse made of brass, he's grounding it in a technology that interests him, such as the astrolabe. And moreover, he's not simply describing a magical, imagined creature, but a mechanical, animated piece of technology. In fact, the horse operates like a mechanical clock, an automated machine or automaton Automata that were beginning to be made and used in England and Northern Europe in the late 14th and 15th century. Other examples of mechanical clocks during this period also contained animated figures such as horses, which were part of the jack work and were made to joust when the clock struck the hour. And we can see a similar but slightly later example of this kind from the 16th century, which can be found in Roskilde Cathedral. And many of you may have seen this, and you may be aware that if you go when the clock strikes the hour, the mechanical figure of St. George will pop out and slay the dragon. And unfortunately, I don't have an image for this, but you can imagine it. So unlike the common people in Chaucer's fictional tale, who cannot believe that the horse is man-made and are convinced it must be a supernatural wonder, Chaucer's more learned contemporary readers and listeners would have understood that he was providing us with a description of a cutting-edge piece of technology, an astronomical mechanical clock complete with automated animal figures. Now this, for 14th century England, was the equivalent of the latest touchscreen GPS-enabled smartphone. Chaucer, shall we say rather facetiously, has lined up outside the Apple store. He's bought his new iPhone, which is that, and he's now reviewing it online for all his friends to read. But at this point, again, you might be wondering, why on earth have I begun a talk on medieval machinery with a piece of fiction and supernatural magic? Chaucer is, after all, imagining another world, and this may be affirming any images you may have of the Middle Ages as simply full of the supernatural, which of course is not true and something that I'll hope to demonstrate. Chaucer has constructed a literary machine, but one which purposefully hinges between the mythical and the marvellous, and the factual and the real. And this is really fitting for his position as an English writer at the end of the Middle Ages, and this is a point I'll come back to later on. Instead, for the moment, let me answer my own question. So why have I begun with a piece of fiction? And I've done this because, as I've already mentioned, I'm a researcher of medieval literature, but my research is interested in the intersection between poetry and the scientific and technological advancements of the Middle Ages, and also because the work that I'm engaged in at the moment is focused on the writings of Chaucer, who, as we can see, was exceptionally scientifically and technologically astute. And this is particular for a poet who is thought to have had no formal university education. Now, my interest in literature and science is not a form of science fiction, so it's not medieval Star Trek or Star Wars, unfortunately. Instead, I'm interested in the way that poetry uses ideas that are rooted in science and technology of the period in creating something like this literary mechanical brass steed. I'm also interested in how objects and the concepts used to conceive and create them are the developments and products of knowledge that was translated and adapted by different people at different points of history. So from the Greeks in classical antiquity to those writing in Arabic in the medieval Islamic world to Latin in Northern Europe, and then its use in the vernacular, such as in English. And this rather brief genealogy of knowledge is itself acknowledged by Chaucer at the beginning of his treatise on an astrolabe. And here he tells his nephew that he's writing the text in English because nothing like it exists in the language. Yet he tells him the Greeks have it in Greek, the Arabs have it in Arabic, the Jews in Hebrew, and the Latin folk in Latin. But as I keep saying, I'm putting astrolabes to one side. And instead this afternoon I wish to focus on medieval technology, in particular these forms of medieval machines as Chaucer's brass horse is modelled on, known as automata. Now I want to focus on pre-modern animated pieces of technology because as a modern society today, we are certainly in the age of technology. Advances in artificial intelligence are rapidly rising, the use of automated robots in the labour workforce is increasing, and we are all becoming more reliant and attached to those handheld devices that keep us perpetually connected to the world, our smartphones. Indeed, according to the statistics portal in 2016, 2.1 billion people across the globe were forecasted to use their smartphones, and according to a recent report in The Guardian, by 2020, in the UK at least, 1 in 3 workers will be replaced by robots. Technology then we can all agree is integral to and is becoming integrated into our modern day lives, and is widely considered to be the marker of our modernity. Now, it's not my intention to tell you that your smartphone was invented in the Middle Ages, as satisfying as that may be. After all, as a global modern society, we are more connected, more tech savvy, and more literate than ever before. But that also doesn't mean that the medieval or the pre-modern world was mechanically or technologically inert. Indeed, the same innate human desires that drive our technologically astute age, the curiosity, intellect, and ingenuity in developing our knowledge and understanding of the world around and beyond us, of applying these principles of knowledge to our lives, of manipulating natural and artificial materials, of creating objects that are functional and aesthetically pleasing. Consider, for example, the language that is used to market each new version of a phone. It's sleek, it's slender, it comes in a different colour. These same desires are not new innovations, and as we've seen already, are apparent in Chaucer's ability to describe a mechanical horse and manipulate the reader's reaction to it. What I wish to do in the next 30 minutes or so is to demonstrate how across the global Middle Ages, people use their curiosity, intellect, and ingenuity to create functional and aesthetically pleasing mechanical technology, such as water clocks, fountains, and animals that roared. And these are known as automata, which refers very broadly to a range of mechanically powered objects, such as the mechanism of an astronomical clock, animated metal animals, anything that really seems to be in motion mechanically and mimics the natural form. And this really goes beyond the modern definition of the term automata, which has connotations of robots and cyborgs. I'd like to note here that what I'm presenting is a collection of different facets of my interest in medieval technology, and I'm hugely indebted to growing scholarship on the subject, in particular this recent work on medieval robots by Ellie Truitt, which was published in 2015. And if you're interested in medieval technology, I'd highly recommend that book. So medieval automata were not only physically constructed objects, but as we've seen, also imagined and fictionalized. Certainly, in many cases, the only evidence we have remaining of their existence comes from written sources, such as textbooks on these ingenious mechanical devices, but also eyewitness travel accounts, historical chronicles, and also, as we've seen, poetry. Now, in order to provide you with a composite view, or as near to one as possible in the time I have, I will, for the remainder, be moving away from Chaucer. And what I'll be doing instead is moving us both backwards in time and across geographical spaces. In fact, in starting with Chaucer, we have started near the end, as it was only in the 14th and 15th centuries in England and Northern Europe that these mechanical objects began to be constructed and described in technological terms. So while Chaucer is reveling in this newfound knowledge that he's describing and creating, at least in imaginative terms, the mechanical clock and other such automata have been imagined, created, and constructed for a number of centuries before him in places further away from England, but not necessarily disconnected from Western Europe. The type of mechanical clockwork machine that he describes was already in existence in the medieval Islamic world, in Central Asia with the Mongols, and this is interestingly where Chaucer sets his tale, and in the Greek-speaking Byzantine world. Now, people in Western Europe did know about and had seen such automata, but for the most part, and until at least the later Middle Ages, so until at least the 14th and 15th century, they interpreted these automata as part of the supernatural and higher advanced form of knowledge, which was influenced not least because they were objects that were coming from foreign, non-Christian worlds, which is why they were considered kind of mythical and marvellous. Now, before I go any further, I realise that I've probably thrown quite a lot at you already. And I'd like to take a moment to explain some of the terminology that I'm using, particularly in terms of geographical spaces. The Islamic world, for instance, refers to a range of Muslim caliphates and sultanates that conquered and governed a variety of geographical places, diverse terrains and ethnicities across a large expanse of time from the 7th to the 15th century. And this can take us anywhere from the south of Spain to Egypt to Baghdad, but also to Central Asia, which was the home of the Mongols during the 13th century. And also into the Byzantine world, the name given to the Roman Empire in the east, which had its capital at Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, and only fell as an empire in 1453. So between these three vast geographical spaces, we cover at least a third of the globe, and across the scope of the timeline of what is considered medieval. So, as you remember, as I said at the beginning, from the 5th to the 15th century. Now, the Middle Ages is often considered to be a reference to only Western Europe. So, by shifting the perspective away from England and Northern Europe, I hope to show a different viewpoint of the Middle Ages. One which demonstrates that through these pieces of technology, we can see two things. The first is the advancement made in other places of the world, and the second is to note that these geographical spaces were interconnected, so from Baghdad and Paris to Mongolia and Flanders, and also across religious boundaries, in particular Islam and Christendom. Now, I'd also like to take a moment just to define what I mean by science and technology. Our modern understanding of the term science was only introduced in the late 19th century to replace the term natural philosopher. Indeed, until then, and from the Middle Ages onwards, those working in science were working in natural philosophy, in particular a form of Aristotelian natural philosophy. And this encompassed studies in astronomy and astrology, mathematics, cosmology, the elements that matter and the natural world. If you were a natural philosopher who studied at a university in Western Europe in the Middle Ages, for instance, you would be well versed in the study of a system of knowledge known as the trivium, which was composed of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Now, this knowledge of natural philosophy was based on the writings made in Greek by such figures as Aristotle, Galen, and Hippocrates, both across Northern Europe and in the Islamic world. In fact, much of this Greek knowledge was known in Arabic before it was known in Latin, and a huge range of Greek texts were translated into Arabic between the 8th to the 10th centuries and were adapted and significantly developed in the fields of what we would today call science, but also philosophy. And some of this knowledge from Arabic was translated into Latin between the 10th and the 12th centuries and was used in the universities of Northern Europe, such as Paris, Oxford, and Bologna. Now, those creating mechanical objects were, generally speaking, natural philosophers who were also adept engineers. Now, the Middle Ages really is the age of the polymath, both in the Islamic world and in Latin Christendom. And so people who could both think highly intellectually but also create mechanical objects. However, in terms of systematizing knowledge, the construction of an animate object that mimics nature was also classed as a mechanical art because it mimics nature. And this was considered to be a craft or an art that was rather low on the prestige of the classifications of knowledge, as was, interestingly enough, also the field of medicine. Now, in terms of mechanical knowledge, much of what was known in the Islamic world was a significant development of writings written during classical antiquity and produced in Alexandria in particular. It's in Alexandria that we find some of the earliest examples of such machinery by figures such as Philo of Alexandria, who created mechanical chirping birds, and Hero of Alexandria, an engineer who wrote a text on how to make automata. Such texts on how to construct machinery and others similar to them were known in the Islamic world because they were translated into Arabic from the 8th century onwards. And it's only really in the 15th century that these Alexandrian texts are translated into Latin in Western Europe, which gives you a sense of the gap in knowledge between these two geographical spaces during the Middle Ages. Now, to get to the automata themselves, there are three objects that I would like to focus on for the rest of the talk. Taking our lead from Chaucer, but moving to the medieval Islamic world, we'll first look at a mechanical clock, in particular a mechanical elephant water clock, which was produced in the al-Jazari. The second is a mechanical water fountain that is thought to have existed in Mongolia, and which we know of through an eyewitness account written in Latin by a traveller from Flanders. And the third is a standing object, a metal sculpture known today as the Pisa Griffin. Each of these objects demonstrate the varied scope of medieval machines, and I wish to focus on different aspects of each of them to give you a sense of not only how varied automata are in the Middle Ages, but also how they were perceived and received. Collectively, they are pieces of early technology created through highly advanced hydraulic and mechanical power, but they are also viewed as pieces of marvels and wonders, and they are artistically and aesthetically pleasing, created by people who are educated, learned and intellectual, but also by artisans and craft workers. Again, I'll repeat that everything I'm presenting to you today is largely indebted to other scholars in the field of history of science and technology, and also art history, which shows you how, from a disciplinary point of view, these objects can garner multiple interests and interpretations. So the first object I'd like to look at today is a mechanical water clock made in the 12th century by an engineer known as al-Jazari. I'd like to just to bring that back up for you. Now we know very little about al-Jazari himself, but we do know that he served as a scholar and engineer at various courts in Anatolia and Egypt. What we have from him is a textbook that he wrote called the Book of Ingenious Mechanical Devices. And this book exists in a number of manuscripts now housed in collections across the world. And this image that we see here is from one of the manuscript pages that you can find in the David collection in Copenhagen. Now, al-Jazari's book has been defined by the historian of science George Sarton, and I quote, as the most elaborate of its kind, and may be considered the climax of this line of Muslim achievement. Now, al-Jazari is not writing in a vacuum, and nor is he the first to write a textbook on mechanical objects. His work builds on writings, experiments, and other automatic machines that were constructed earlier in the medieval Islamic world. Now, the most well-known text besides al-Jazari's also goes by the title of the Book of Ingenious Devices, and it was written by a group of scholars and engineers called the Banu Musa, three brothers who came from the family of Musa. Their book on ingenious devices was published in the year 850 and had designs for over 100 trip vessels and automata, including, and I quote, 7 fountains, 4 self-trimming lamps, which I'm not quite sure what that refers to, an automatic musical instrument, a gas mask for approaching polluted wells, and a mechanical grab for excavating in the beds of streams. And I assume this is a kind of a litter picker, one of those long things that you can pick out your crisp packets on. For each of these inventions, the Banu Musa included a description and an instruction, including a diagram and a drawing. Now, as Eddie Truitt notes, and I quote, these were produced by a sophisticated, if empirical, use of the principle of hydrostatics, acrostatics, and mechanics. The components used included tanks, pipes, floats, siphons, lever arms balanced on axles, taps with multiple borings, cone valves, racks and pinion gears, and screw and pinion gears. So really forms of mechanics. But the Banu Musa were not the only ones creating such inventions in the medieval Islamic world. We also have a description of a mechanical water clock that travelled from Baghdad to Paris in the 9th century. Now, this clock was given to Charlemagne, ruler of the Carolingian Empire, which occupied much of Western Europe in the late 8th and early 9th century, and it was a gift given to him by the Muslim caliph Harun al-Rashid, who was the ruler of the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. Now, this gift of a water clock was recorded by a historical chronicler at Charlemagne's court, and I couldn't find an image for it, but I have some words instead, so you can imagine it in your mind. And this describes it. He said it was marvellously contrived by mechanical art, on which the course of the 12 hours was marked by a clepsydra with the right number of little bronze balls, which would fall into a basin when the hour was complete and make its sound. This clock also had the same number of horsemen, and they would, through 12 windows, come forth at the end of the hours. With the force of their exit, they would close the proper number of windows which had before been opened. So the mechanism of the clock was propelled by a hydraulic system operated by a number of balls, which would force animated horsemen to come chirping out of windows. And it's described as marvellous. It says it's marvellously contrived. It's a piece of wonder, because at this time, in the Carolingian period, they're still using sundials. You know, this is a real piece of advanced mechanism. Now, this form of water clock, this clepsydra, is superseded in the 12th century by the one created by Al-Jazari. Now, Al-Jazari's water clock, elephant water clock, and this is a drawing of it, stands at 7 meters high. It's grounded by a construction of an Indian elephant, upon which sit two men, one of whom is called a mahout, the one who drives or rides the elephant, another a scribe. Upon this we see two dragons and falcons, and sometimes they're considered to be phoenixes, but people interpret the image differently. A bird, a Persian carpet, and a turban figure, this man who sits on the balcony. Now, the clock works using a hydraulic system that can tell you whether it's either half past the hour, so 30 minutes past the hour, or at the hour itself. Now, instead of me trying to explain this system, which I think would not do this machinery any justice, I found a very helpful video to explain it. And the video explains an eyewitness account of seeing the water clock in action. And the person who wrote this account is a man called Ibn Battuta, who was a traveller from Morocco who saw a construction of this elephant water clock in the 14th century, so 2 centuries after it was engineered. So it simply isn't, the elephant water clock isn't simply a hypothetical machine. It was constructed and it has been reconstructed according to Al-Jazari's instructions. And one such reconstruction can be found in the Ibn Battuta Mall in Dubai, which I'll show you an image of in a minute. But first, we can watch this video and get it to work. Sorry.
I was only 22 when I left Tangiers, the place of my birth, in the year 725, or 1325 in the Christian era, and I never expected to travel so far or to see so much. Nor did I fully realize how much of the globe is covered by our Muslim caliphate and the great prosperity and peacefulness of the civilization therein. At this time, our philosophers and scholars excel all others in the quality of their writing, our engineers and architects in the beauty of their buildings, our scientists and inventors devise the most clever creations. But of all the wondrous man-made things I saw, few delighted me so much as the ingenious elephant clock, which you see before you now. Is this a clock, you ask? How does it tell the time? How does it work? I will tell you now. The number of hours since sunrise is shown on the silver and black disc at the top of the clock, and the number of minutes into the hour is shown by the scribe's pen. The movements of the clock are regulated by a most wonderful mechanism that sits in a tank inside the elephant's body, a perforated floating bowl. There is a small hole in the floating bowl that regulates the speed at which it sinks. As it slowly submerges over half an hour, it tugs via a system of pulleys the scribe and his pen. When it is completely submerged, the bowl quickly tilts, sinks, and triggers a more dramatic sequence of events. Inside the cupola at the top of the clock, a channel of balls is tilted so that a stopper is lifted to allow one to fall, hitting a fan that turns the phoenix. The ball then drops out of one of the falcon's beaks into the serpent's mouth. As the serpent falls, rotating around its pivot, the weight of the ball tugs a rope that resets the bowl back to the surface of the water. The ball drops again into a vase that triggers the mahout's mallet and hits a cymbal, which sounds a half hour. As the ball collects in a trough, the float begins to submerge again, and the whole process repeats itself with subtle adjustments for the second half of the hour. This ingenious device is the work of Badi al-Zaman Abdul Ez ibn Ismail ibn al-Razaz al-Jazari, who was a Muslim engineer who lived north of Baghdad under the Ayyubi dynasty, shortly after Saladin the Magnificent. Al-Jazari built a large number of mechanical devices that revolutionized engineering. He described many of them in his book of knowledge of ingenious mechanical devices. In the elephant clock, he used an Indian elephant, Chinese serpents, Arabian architecture, and Greek water technology, thus expressing the universal and equal nature of Islam, a fact that I have been fortunate enough to discover in my own travels. He was a pious Muslim and a great engineer who gave birth to the concept of automatic machines. Who knows what other wonderful inventions will follow in the future from this incredible notion.
That I think was a much better explanation than I could have given. But you can see that it's a hydraulic water machine, and that Al-Jazari provides us with such exact ways of constructing it that it has been reconstructed. And this is a reconstruction of it in a mall in Dubai, and there's a number of other ones as well that have been done. I'm not sure if they actually use it to tell the time, but it is there. So the water clock is a fully functioning hydraulic machine that contains kind of these animated people and animals. So the symbol drops and tells us, the bird at the top moves, the man goes forward. And all of these figures are made out of brass, and this is the same metal that Chaucer, for instance, so promptly observes in those used for his magic horse. Now, in Ibn Battuta's description, you might have noticed that he describes it with wonder, and is also very kind of almost a form of propaganda in telling you what a pious Muslim Al-Jazari was. But he's also tells you he's also looking at this in terms of scientific incredulity. He understands it as a mechanical, technical machine that is engineered and that uses the principles of natural philosophy to work. And this wasn't always the case for writers, particularly Europe when they're looking at these automatic machines, who sometimes look at them in terms of marvels and wonders, as we've seen in the description that Chaucer gives us at the beginning of this talk, where he's playing with this idea of the marvellous and the wondrous. And in turning from this one eyewitness account, I want to move to another that describes a second object, a mechanical water fountain. And this eyewitness account is also made by a traveller like Ibn Battuta, but the traveller in question is writing in Latin and is from Flanders, the northern part of Belgium. And this traveller is called William of Rubruck, who lived between 1220 and 1293 and was part of the Franciscan order. And like many who were part of the medieval mendicant orders, either the Franciscans or the Dominicans, William travelled to different parts of the globe on missionary purposes, and he documented these journeys. And he's known in particular for his journey into the Mongol Empire. He visited different Mongol Khans, including travelling to the historical walled city called Sarai, so the very same as Chaucer's fictional Mongol king. And in 1253, William sets out to visit the great Khan at a place called Karakoram, which was the capital of the Mongol Empire during the 13th century. And Karakoram is near the Orkhon River Valley in central Mongolia. And while he was here, he saw and he documented witnessing a water fountain that had been constructed for the Khan. And this is a reconstruction of this water fountain in Karakoram. This water fountain was in the shape of a tree, and it was made out of silver. At the base of the tree were the construction of 4 silver lions, and these lions contained a spout at their mouths that enabled milk to pour out of them. Now above these 4 lions were 4 serpents who tailed across the tree, and these 4 serpents also each had a different liquid spout out of its mouth, either wine, milk, honey, and mead. Unfortunately, I don't have a video to show you as to how this works, so you'll have to make do with this image. But William does describe the fountain, and he says that between these 4 conduits in the top, William, and this William he's referring to is a Parisian man who was in Mongolia, who William of Rubruck thinks constructed this fountain. So this William made an angel holding a trumpet, and underneath the tree he made a vault in which a man can be hid. And pipes go up through the heart of the tree to the angel. In the first place he made bellows, but they did not give enough wind. Outside the palace is a cellar in which the liquids are stored, and there are servants all ready to pour them out when they hear the angel trumpeting. When the drink is wanted, the head butler cries to the angel to blow his trumpet. Then he who is concealed in the vault, hearing this, blows with all his might in the pipe leading to the angel, and the angel places a trumpet to his mouth and blows the trumpet loudly. Then the servants who are in the cellar, hearing this, pour the different liquids onto the proper conduit. So William describes this in terms of human agency. You know, it's these people these 4 servants who are scrambling around in the cellar, pouring different liquids into the mouths, for them to come out the mouths of these serpents. But he's interested in how it works mechanically, which fits in with the ideas of marvels and wonders in the 13th century. So the idea of a wonder is something that can motivate intellectual inquiry. And so this is why he's talking about it in a mechanical and technical sense. But in his description, he also tells us that this is something that is innate to the Mongols. This is something that the Mongols themselves are able to create, as opposed to people in Western Europe. It's the Mongols who can understand this technology. Now, my final example differs from these first 2. And my final example is a metal sculpture known as the Pisa Griffin. And it's a sculpture of a mythical beast which has the head of an eagle, the ears of a horse, and the body of a lion. And this griffin is one of the largest sculptures of medieval Islamic art. It's over 3 feet tall. And there are a few others that are similar to it, including a sculpted lion, which is now held in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. Now, there's a whole tradition of smaller animal objects created in Islamic art that we use for different purposes such as perfume bottles and incense holders. And of course, larger sculptures that were also used as fountainheads, and we have these large line fountainheads in the Alhambra, for instance, in Granada. Now, it's thought that this metal sculpture in particular was constructed around the 11th century in the Islamic world, so either in Spain or in North Africa, but we're not quite sure. And it contains Islamic design, so including Arabic Kufic calligraphic script, which runs across its chest, as well as arabesque designs that are engraved across its entire body, which you can kind of make out in that image. Now, the griffin has an opening at its mouth, its rear, and under its stomach. And inside it, it's hollow inside, but it has a globe-shaped cup which sits near the end of its stomach. Now, this metal sculpture somehow found itself in Pisa around the 12th century, and had for a very long time sat on top of the cathedral. But for a very long time it perplexed people, and in particular it perplexed Islamic art historians who couldn't figure out either how it arrived in Pisa, when it arrived in Pisa, and what its purpose and function was. And it was once thought to be a fountainhead similar to these line fountainheads that we see in the water fountain in Mongolia, but it was very strange to find a fountainhead on top of a cathedral. And very recently an art historian has theorized and determined that it is in fact a sculpted automata, as when it sat on the top of the cathedral and a gust of wind blew through the hole that's in its rear that comes out and the hole that's at the top, the griffin actually roared. So it's a mythical beast that roars. So very different from the mechanical clock and the water fountain. But I hope that in the last 45 minutes I've given you a kind of taste of the range of medieval machines that existed across the Middle East, Central Asia and in Northern Europe, that were both physical objects but also objects that were imagined and fictionalized. Now there's a whole lot more that can be said about such technology, not only in the types of physical objects that were invented and constructed, so we also have examples of singing birds, of human figures that guard the dead, and these astral brazen heads, but also the manner in which they are absorbed and commented upon in literary and cultural documents that really reflects the changing cultural attitude towards them depending on location, and that is really fascinating. These automata, I would say, occupy a liminal position, particularly in Western Europe, where it took a really long time for the mechanics and technology to be divorced from the ideas of the supernatural and magic. So when Chaucer, for instance, is playing poetically with metal flying horses and more mechanical astronomical clocks are being constructed, at the same time natural philosophers or scientist/engineer are also being mythologized as sorcerers, complete with legendary talking astral heads that can predict the future. And this idea continues well into the early modern period, so the 16th and 17th century, where the idea of the brazen or bronze head allied to particular medieval natural philosophers, such as the English Franciscan Roger Bacon, became increasingly popular. And these legendary heads were pieces of ridicule that were magical and mechanical, but also crafty, a kind of supernatural kind of mechanical, and they could only answer yes or no. And these astral heads are a world away from what we've seen from Al-Jazri's elephant water clock, but comparatively speaking are not so far away in our past from the modern day world. And so I started with mythology, and I thought I would end with mythology. Thank you very much.
Questions, comments?
First of all, thank you for a fascinating talk. Really enjoyed it. I was wondering, you mentioned it and almost at the end repeated this dichotomy in Europe. You had this trivium and quadrivium, and then you had the sort of more applied technologies which had much lower status, such as medicine in particular, and even engineering. My question is, did that also apply in these other worlds, like the Mongol kingdom and Arabic world?
Yeah. So somebody like Al-Jazari is a polymath in the sense that he's a natural philosopher, but he's also an engineer. And I don't think that the divide is quite as pronounced in the Islamic world as it was in Northern Europe. And that's something that you really see in the later, so in, say in the 16th and 17th century, where the supernatural, really, you know, the medieval world is really starting to become aligned with the supernatural. So I think perhaps it is something more specific to
To the European.
to the European world. This idea of the mechanical arts comes from somebody called who comes from a text called the D-IAS by Hugh of Victor, who's writing in the 12th century, and he categorizes these pieces of knowledge, and he says that there's this idea of the mechanical arts and engineering and medicine as part of this. But it's interesting. I've never really thought about it in putting the two side by side. I think, yeah, something to look into. I think.
Yeah, thank you again for a great talk. Just a comment on that wonderful griffin figure from Pisa. If it's from 12th century, then it makes quite a lot of sense because of the Pisans had their own quarter in Antioch, and Antioch became one of the great translation centres. So I'm wondering if it may have been somebody involved with the translations who brought it over.
Yeah, I mean, it could be a piece of loot that came over somehow from a Crusader state, and there is a whole, there's an article actually that links Pisa and Antioch in that way. I think because it's such a big piece, I mean, it's a huge sculpture. I think you still wonder how on earth somebody transported that and why on earth they took it to Pisa, but it may certainly come from Antioch, yeah. Absolutely.
My question is with my book historian hat on. This book with the ingenious machines, do we know if that's an authorial title or an editorial title? Because I love the idea of somebody calling their own book a book of ingenious machines.
I think it's probably an editorial.
Darn.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So there's a number of book of ingenious machines, and I can't remember what they're called in Arabic, but there may be, yeah. I mean, something for your own ego, I think.
Yeah.
I'm inventing an ingenious machine. Yeah.
Just wanted to say something about the notion of marvels and also fairyland, and particularly in the initial quote by Chaucer, is that in the 12th century and then the 13th century there was a very clear definition of marvels, and it was that these were things, these were effects that we didn't know the causes of. But it's not that they didn't have causes. I mean, it was just, and Aquinas, for example, talks about that he says very specific that the products of the artisan can be marvelous to people who don't see how they were, don't understand how they're done. So marvel just means I don't know how it works. So anything that I saw that I didn't know how it worked was a marvel. Was a marvel for me. And in terms of the fairyland, it's also very interesting that in the at least in French literature in the 12th century up into the 13th and very end of the 12th century, fairies are mentioned, but they never appear. And so they're never actually characters in the stories, they just are mentioned. And when they are mentioned, they're mentioned as basically engineers. That is, that they make medical products, they make clothing, anything they make is wonderful. It's a designer. You want jeans that are fairy made, for example. I mean, anything that they make is really, really top-notch stuff. And they never actually come into the story, but their products come into the stories, the things that they have made. And so again, it's a kind of, it's fairies are people who know how to make things that the rest of us don't know how to make. But again, it's not a notion of magic. It's a notion of simply, it's a technology that I don't understand yet. So I mean, it was interesting to see the two brought together in Chaucer there in the beginning.
And certainly by the time Chaucer's writing, fairies do have a sense of the other world as well. In that you do see that in some of the romances that are written in Middle English during the period. So yeah, the two marry well together, I think.
Other comments or questions? I may have a small thing also. Thank you very much. I was thinking about these courts or rulers and such that have. There are also these stories, because you were showing us things that have somehow survived, and
Yeah.
there's a representation of it, or this description of it, or the thing is still there. I was thinking of these descriptions of like thrones with
Yeah,
things
there's a-
coming
yeah,
out,
there's Bit of
singing
time
birds and all this.
travel.
Yeah, and you have this idea that they may have been in sort of competition. They one ruler has, oh, this other guy has this, I need something bigger that can do
Yeah.
the same thing or even more wondrous things. And so it's sort of a, I mean, obviously it's not something any private person can construct on his
Yeah.
own, even if reading the
Yeah.
description. It's somehow the ruler's.
Yeah, patronage, yeah, that I mean, and Aldous is an engineer in a number of different courts during his lifetime, so I assume that is how he's able to construct some of these machines, and the fact that, they're given it, like Harun al-Rashid gives this water clock as a gift to Charlemagne, that there's a huge degree of patronage involved, I think, in being able to create these inventions. I mean, it's the same today, isn't it? I mean, a startup, for instance, needs a lot of money to start up. Like if you want to create something, if you want to engineer something, yeah, there's always a patron lurking behind somewhere.
Other questions, comments? Okay, I think we should thank Shazia once again.